What's going on, guys? It's Frito here for your Overwatch. Overwatch Classic comes out today. Many of you would have never played this version of the game, and frankly, a lot of us didn't either because they patched a lot of these things out rather quickly. So this is a pristine launch era version of Overwatch, patch 1.0. Few things you'll notice: you'll be playing 2CP or Assault, again, getting stuck at chokes, trying to work your way through, and a lot of things are different in the overall gameplay. I'll give a few brief takeaways and then maybe a bigger conclusion at the end, but much lower healing numbers. The mid-fight is a lot slower, where characters are more static and stiff in their playstyle, whereas Overwatch 2 is amped up to get you brawling and fighting all the time. A lot of characters are more positional and tactical and more easily countered, so they have to position much more carefully. Healing is at a premium, as there isn't any crazy healing abilities whatsoever in the entire game, and ultimate combos are going to be very important. In fact, probably the number one thing you'll want to have in your team comps is a defensive ult, because if you don't have one, then the enemy will eventually stack a bunch of ults, press Q on you, and easily win. And especially in a quick playstyle format for a mode like Assault, if they do that, they just win the game. So that makes support ults very essential to being able to survive up against those combos. Now, we're going to go through all of the changes here and give a bit of feedback as well as advice on how to handle some of these aspects of the game. There was one thing that I wanted to point out: the projectile sizes are reverted. You'll have to play around health pools more, and if your ult gets canceled, it actually, part of it gets refunded. That's one of the things they eventually changed. In fact, in beta, there was a cute thing where if you took damage, you gained ult. They got rid of that really quick, though. That's not in this version. Anyway, we've got the no limits version of the game. Cassidy is reworked back to the old version of the cowboy, where you'll now have flashbang, which is a very quick projectile on a set arc with quite a big radius, actually, and it applies a mini stun. So it's going to cancel ults that are transformative, that like Moira ult, for example. There is no Moira in this game, but things that you can cancel, like Reaper ult is a better example. And one way that you can outplay it as like a tracer or a flanker hero is trying to jump as it's going to hit you, because flashbang sets you on a set animation where there's like a head bob, and the Cassidy player can either line up a headshot, which can be kind of difficult because the hitbox is moving, and the hitboxes in Overwatch 1.0 are a bit smaller than they are now, or he can go for Fan the Hammer, which is ridiculously overpowered at 70 damage per projectile, okay? This was one of the most unbalanced things in this version of the game, where you can Fan the Hammer, roll, you can Fan the Hammer multiple times in a row on a tank, and it just will destroy their health pool, okay? This damage value is outrageous. So Cassidy was very, very strong in this early iteration, but doesn't have a lot of the other benefits and the fluidity to his kit. Like combat roll isn't going to give you damage resistance. Deadeye is basically a useless ultimate. You kind of just stand there waiting to get shot at. No damage resistance on it. And a lot of times the top players would just use Deadeye as a quick reload, because you could Fan the Hammer or shoot a few times and then hit Deadeye and cancel it to shoot again with your primary weapon. That's really the way that it was used back in the day. Major changes to Genji. Dragon Blade lasts 8 seconds, okay? 8 seconds of the ultimate. And a lot of these ults and parts of the game were because these characters weren't mastered at the launch, okay? Once Genji got maximized rather quickly, even like in the first year, players really understood like how you could exploit the mobility, and of course, as a win more mechanic with Swift Strike, resetting on kill, the Dragon Blade would sweep through everybody. So that's another reason why you really need a defensive ult. But keep in mind, there's no Ana in this version of the game. So there's no nano boost, but you can damage amp, but you kind of don't need to, honestly. Like, the damage values are so reliable that Genji's Dragon Blade, if you're any good at Genji now, like going back in time to play this version of Genji, is going to be kind of outrageous. Pharah is going to be hanging in the air a little bit more now. And the playstyle difference here is, back in the day, her damage was much more about splash, like the way that it was distributed in her kit. So because of that, you could kind of miss a lot more than you can now. Like, they've re-engineered the kit for it to be about the damage getting benefited to hitting directs. Now, especially with Mercy on Pharah, this was super oppressive for the average tier of player, because you get players that maybe can't hit a shot on any DPS character, but Pharah with splash damage, getting damage amped by Mercy, this was super oppressive, and even was a top meta strategy for a long time. Like, there was an era of the game early on where Pharah was one of the best DPS, being able to fly super far and just be really flexible in how she controls the engagements, kind of similar to what the effect of the Overwatch 2 reworked Pharah had for a period of time as well. In order to counteract her, there's a couple characters that... Wait, hold on. Was there not Widowmaker here? I swear there was a Widowmaker. Oh no, that's right. It's split up into 2 categories, guys. I forgot about this. And I love looking back at this because oftentimes you get in arguments with people about the soul of Overwatch, and they'll make claims like Overwatch was designed to have X, Y, and Z. Well, whatever they think it is. In reality, Overwatch was designed to have 4 roles, not 3. It had offense and defense. And in theory, it was supposed to guide you along to say, these heroes are a little bit better at going and taking space or attacking when you're on the attacking side of the map, which is important for assault, I suppose. And then defensive heroes are ones that play back or are better at defending. But it's a little, I don't know, doesn't really help. It's not really helpful. Like, it just means one of them has more movement usually, but they went away from that. Reaper is quite significantly different. He's not going to have automatic lifesteal on his weapons. Now instead, he's going to have to go pick up the orbs or the souls of his enemies. And this was kind of neat in a way. It made like a little mini game where you'd want to all in on the enemy and you had to get a kill in order to get your self heal. Otherwise, you were kind of screwed. A lot of other ways that you were screwed. Reaper has a high risk, high reward ability, and a lot of the game was designed this way back in the day, where Wraith form was what they called all in, which means you press that button and you're committed to that animation until it's done. And because of that, a character like Cassidy could really line up and be ready for you to escape Wraith form every single time, knowing exactly when you're going to come out of it. And you could throw a stun so that you couldn't ult or maybe interrupts your ult. So Wraith form much, much weaker than before. Overall, the health steal is also much weaker because you have to confirm a kill in order to get it. Even if in theory you could get more health, you kind of don't need it. Like, it's less reliable. Like, once they're dead, like, you don't need as much health. But a cool thing you can do is when you use Death Blossom, which is a much worse ult in this version, I would say, because it's harder to use, but you can go try to scoop up the souls because you're otherwise you're kind of a vulnerable target. However, there is also less ways to counteract it. So kind of a fun way for Reaper to play, but weird and stiff for sure. There was a lot of improvements, especially to the speed of Shadow Step. You'll just notice, like, as Reaper, you just got to hold your position. You got to camp, because if you try to play fluidly and like as a flanker, it's not really going to work. But he does have higher health and a pretty easy to use weapon, so that was the kind of the offset for that. Soldier 76, not really changed so much. He won't have the laser beam rifle anymore. It'll be a random RNG spread, more similar to Call of Duty. This was the Call of Duty character back in the day. So you could burst fire in order to make your shots more accurate, because otherwise it would be RNG if you held it down too much. And if you use the show accuracy on your crosshair, that'll be more obvious that that's the case. But having a character that can add some healing made him really reliable. Now, he's not as powerful as Cassidy, but there was a bit of a trade-off there where Cassidy had way more firepower, but Soldier was a little easier to play. And that's still kind of the case now, but they over time made Soldier like better at range, or, you know, obviously tactical visor is pretty easy to use. For the average tier of player, Soldier was more approachable. So that is how you'll expect him to be. Tracer, the major difference here is the pulse bomb is extremely devastating. And part of the reason for that is at the launch of the game, players weren't necessarily good at sticking pulse bombs. Like, in the first year, one of the most successful pro teams was one of the first teams to really reliably stick Tracer pulse bombs soon on Tracer. Just the fact that he would reliably hit a pulse bomb in your spawn as you're coming out, like, that was like an unheard of idea for any pro to do at the time, right at the start. Over time, players learned how to like control the blink distance and make sure that the projectile always hits and tracking the movement, and people drilled this in order to get good at it. And then so much so that I think like average players often will hit pulse bombs. But at the start of the game, it felt like so weird and awkward to throw, you had a high percentage chance to miss it. Now, our new player base, our current player base going back, I don't think that'll be the case. And you'll notice just like how devastating that pulse bomb is, especially since it can kind of nuke a tank. Now, back then, the theory kind of was that you would want to ult combo, because Zarya would clump them all together with Grav, and then you come in with a pulse bomb that does so much damage, everything in it is getting destroyed. So anyway, pulse bomb, very, very strong. And keep in mind, some of those game modes that are more about ult combos and big team fights and team wipes, those are the things you want to go for. There's a little bit less of the constant tempo play of sending someone back to spawn, gaining a little bit of ground. Like push in Overwatch 2 is very much Overwatch 2, whereas assault in Overwatch 1 is everything you know about Overwatch 1. It's like group together, big team fight, and there's a lot of meaningless kills because the defender's advantage is so high in assault. If you don't combo and do the team play appropriately, you just won't even affect the objective. So there's a lot of trash kills you could waste your ult on. Whereas in Overwatch 2, they kind of re-engineered it so you can always be making some sort of impact, even with a trash frag, where there's way more trash frags in the tactical version of the game where we're playing assault. Now onto the defensive heroes. Bastion utterly reworked. In the beta version, he had his own personal shield. They eventually got rid of that because it was super annoying. But now he'll have two forms. The recon mode, where he shoots his little mini Soldier 76 rifle with a spread, but he also can transform into a static sentry, where he's immobile. Now, there's many versions that they went through with this, but lots and lots of ammo, okay? And can just stare at a choke as long as he wants. Really oppressive. Also riding the payload with tanks to protect him, made for the pirate ship strategy, which actually was a pro meta for some time, especially on Junkertown, just based on how the angles of the map work. You can kind of easily get to the cart, and then once you ride the cart with the Bastion and tanks protecting him, you had a lot of favorable angles as you make your way through Junkertown in the original version of the map, which perhaps isn't even in this map pool, but just as an example, the kind of thing, you could still do it on route. Wasn't as good, but similar. Now, they say his biggest weakness is getting attacked from behind. He's got a crit marker there. It's pretty hard to get there, honestly. I wouldn't say that's even the easiest way to deal with him. Usually projectiles are a little bit easier to get an off angle and work him down, because the problem is his health is higher. So if you're not maybe sticking him with a pulse bomb, the tracer damage often isn't enough. So you can make coordinated attacks, but ultimately you kind of free die to Bastion, okay? Like the Bastion set up, there's a choke, you try to walk in as a Cassidy or something, you just instantly die, okay? That's where like the counter picking is better in Overwatch 1 kind of comes from, because there's certain characters that you will not get onto this Bastion and he will hard carry the game. You won't get out of the choke. You have to swap, right? In order to deal with it. That was pretty controversial at the time because especially for the average tier of player, Bastion was a lot of firepower without a lot of work, and just a little bit of tactics to protect him was sort of an auto win. In fact, you'd get into these overtime rounds where it was very common to see a Bastion set up because it catches you out. If you make a little bit of a mistake, you poke out too early, you don't scout it, you don't know it's there, and you just walk out and someone dies. In Overwatch 1, one of your teammates dies, there's no team fight anymore. There's no such thing as trying to go off and get your own kill, because remember, defender's advantage, even if you got a kill, they're going to be right there next to the point oftentimes, especially on assault on defending B. Hanamura, for example, the door is a defensible position for the point. They can just turn the corner and they look at the point right there. Volskaya, same thing. You have to get like 4 kills for a stagger fight to be worth it. There's never really a good opportunity for going off and getting your own kills. You have to play as a team. Otherwise, you just can't win the game at all. And Bastion is probably one of the better characters at dealing with that. So, also has a self-repair button. Just another like annoyance. Like this just meant like if you wanted to solo poke him down, well, he'll just self-repair. Not only does he have his team to help him, so it's like a double down on you better not try to fight him alone, because he auto wins holding with his team. So ultimate goes into tank form, shoots rockets. That's pretty cool. There's a lot of tricks you could do with that as well. You transform into the tank and you can rocket jump, I believe, to get up to higher positions. And the projectile size was kind of massive and did loads of damage. So direct hitting something was destructive. Hanzo, more static as well, can wall climb, but cannot lunge. So that means any character with mobility that gets on him is super screwed, except for the fact that he can use Scatter Arrow, which shoots right at the ground and explodes and can one-shot a Winston, okay? Like, it's supposed to go into a choke, or you can toss it at the objective. You can toss it all over the place, and it randomly RNG, simple geometry in order to accidentally kill things. Happens all the time. But the most reliable way to use it is to angle it right at the ground so it bursts up at the tank's feet, and I don't know, it could do like 800 damage or something in one go. So you could one-shot a tank with Storm Arrow. So you'd be very careful engaging on a Hanzo, and it was kind of risk reward. Again, a lot of the patch 1.0 is like that, where if Hanzo's caught out and he misses Storm Arrow, the Winston like instantly kills him. But if he lands a Storm Arrow, the Winston is instantly dead. Like the tank just gets deleted. So that's how that kind of worked. Junkrat also way less mobile. His frags hurt him, so you can't take your own explosion damage, which is a common thing we'll see here. You only get one conch mine, so you can't really be mobile around the map. It just doesn't work. But you are pretty oppressive on the maps that you are good on. So you're still really, really good on Anubis if you get in position. The counter picking was more severe in this version of the game because you don't have any mobility options, and Pharah's got all the mobility options. So dealing with a Pharah's Junkrat, much, much harder. You might say it's still hard, but because with 2 mines and being able to launch yourself and no self-damage, Junk in the modern day, or the power crept era of the game, was much less counter-pickable if you at least could master him. Whereas here, there's like almost no chance that you're going to do that. I also seem to remember that there was like a timer on the mine as well. Some of the minute differences, they don't list here, otherwise they could talk all day. There was some limitations on the mine, if I recall correctly. Changes to Mei. The Mei wall is way stronger, which is important because, well, on a map like Hanamura, the entire game becomes about getting the Mei wall up in order to block out the brawler tanks. Now, you can play dive to get around it, but diving past the choke where your backline struggles to get in is also kind of difficult. So good luck with that. 500 health on the Mei wall pillars, and well, half the time it's used just to troll your team and spawn, so they can't get out. But the primary fire from Endothermic Blaster quickly freezes individual enemies. It turns them into ice cubes, in fact, but not very good overall. Like, kind of a noob weapon. If you don't realize that you're playing against a Mei, or she surprises you and she blasts you down for a couple seconds, you turn into an icicle and she easily can line up a headshot and kill you. But if you are aware and dodge it at all, then the Mei's weapon looks really bad. So problem with this Mei, if you're a higher tier player, you probably don't get caught out by this, but average tier players, very, very easy to do this, to have this playstyle. Very effective. She can still freeze through Diva or Genji's Reflect, for example. So there's still some counterplay there. I would say this one is one of the better heroes to be in the defensive category because it was pretty difficult to play Mei on attack. Not so good, but very, very good at defending, especially a lot of these chokes. And when you consider a lot of the gameplay is like getting on the point, so the enemy has to rush into you, well, that makes Mei wall and her ultimate very, very good. Even better than some of the defensive ults that exist. So she has a very interesting and powerful position in this version of the game. Torbjorn, very different, builds a static turret that he can hammer on to upgrade. So he places it down, and then he can upgrade it to level 2. And with his ultimate, Molten Core, he pops that, and the turret gets supercharged to level 3. Okay? So basically like a Bob. That's the better way to say it. Like, no one really complained about the auto-targeting and the turret nature of Bob because he has a personality, but people hated this turret. The turret was so good that often the Torbjorn player would get wiped out because you don't have the overload ability in this, okay? You're just normal little Torbjorn with a less effective weapon and no brawler ability at all. You're all in on the value of this turret, getting value pretty much, so much so that it defending for you, let's say like at a high-rise spot on Hanamura, they might clear you and your turret stays there, and it's got so much stats, especially with the ultimate. When it's got the ultimate, you just kind of run from it, that it can get play of the game on your own. Now, the way he did have some sustain was he would pick up armor scrap. So in between team fights, there's like a little mini game where you go get resources, sort of similar to the Reaper Souls, but the scrap lasts longer, but you collect some scrap and you can give your teammates extra health, right? In between the fights. Sort of like a Brig Rally, but slower and in the mid fight. So this had a little bit more of a builder-esque playstyle, more similar to like Team Fortress 2. Torbjorn is kind of like that, where he's a much more tactical hero, not a brawler at all, and, well, kind of designed to have all of his value in that turret. Even when you see something like this, it kind of reminds you that Jeff Kaplan actually sort of wished that they only made certain heroes available on attack or defense, because part of the problem that they had is like, if you pick this kind of hero on attack, Torb on attack, really, really bad, okay? Because you have to gain the ground first to set up a good turret and all your values in that turret, right? Whereas if you're at the choke on Hanamura, needing to get through, the enemy doesn't have to fight into your turret. So you need your team to clear out the space for you to get the thing. And then maybe then you can sort of win more by once you set it up, then it's nuts. There's some heroes like this that are high risk, high reward for sure, which is why they eventually reworked him. Widowmaker, far more lethal with faster charge shots and more damage dealt at long range. I'm not sure that stat was kind of irrelevant. Like, yes, they reined the range in, but who's hitting the all the way across the map shots anyway? Like, I don't know. Either way, she's lethal, I think. But if I recall correctly, there's a quick scope mechanic where you could really get a fast charge shot off that was lethal, especially amplified by Mercy's damage amp. So whereas on one hand, Pharah was really effective with Mercy and kind of oppressive for just about every tier of play, Widow at the highest tiers, really, really oppressive, okay? This version had to be reined in, and that's on top of the fact that, like, Cassidy's fan the hammer to 70 damage. So there's a few damage heroes here that really stand out as being the top performers. That's the whole DPS or offense and defense category. Not that many tanks and supports, guys. Like, we're pretty short on options here. D.Va, very importantly, and this is a character I want to look to when people say that the game is designed for, I don't know, tank synergy or multi-tank or things like that. Very clearly, this was not. D.Va's defense matrix was terrible, basically. It pretty much was only good for herself, okay? Defense matrix was an all-in ability, just like Reaper's Wraith form at the launch of the game, where it made, you could eat damage from the front, but you were stuck using it. So you could fly to clear off the high ground of Numbani. That's like the only spot where it was kind of decent, because everything's usually down a lane where they're holding the high ground, and then you could eat a lot of damage. You can't flicker it on and off, step one. But then also, it doesn't really do anything if you're behind your teammate. So you have to be in front like a main tank, essentially. It was later on in 2017 where they changed it entirely, put it on the resource meter, and more importantly, allowed you to mask your teammate with it. So if you put it through them, you could catch things in front of them, which developed the entire competitive meta around D.Va for the next X amount of years, where she became a dominant tank, not just with dive. I mean, it made the dive era possible, where you would move Winston around, and because of the tank synergy of Winston and D.Va, everything else got steamrolled. Like, you had to just run from the Winston and D.Va, and if your characters didn't have mobility in that era, you instantly died, because you'd be targeted, two things run at you, the flanks come in, there's no way to defend it. Nothing existed in the game that could have defended against that. Then, as the game slowed down a little bit over time and years, different characters getting added, Brig, etc., then D.Va could use that to be defensive, more so, with a death ball comp as well. So this version of D.Va, very, very bad, though, overall. No micro missiles, defense matrix pretty weak. She also could eliminate herself if she was in the blast radius of her call mech ultimate, right? The ult explodes, you could get play of the game and accidentally wipe yourself out at the same time. Kind of crazy, okay? Not a very competitive hero in this iteration. So have fun. D.Va's very popular, but not very good in this version for sure. Reinhardt's got more shield, but obviously doesn't have all of the reworks to his abilities. No pin cancel, no pin steering. Pin is a way more wonky ability in this. Basically, the advice at the time was don't use pin, because you'll be so out of position. Like, you need to be certain that the pin is going to not just land, hit, but send you in a place that you'll be safe after. Remember, there's not any big support abilities to bail you out. So if you're a little out of position, you're just going to die. There's no way to save you unless they use an ultimate to save you, and you need those defensive ultimates to counteract their ultimates. So much more punishing where you position as Reinhardt in this version, and you're much less offensive, though they do say that Earth Shatter is a little more forgiving. I don't know, it's pretty nasty in the most recent buffed version as well. Higher, I think, is it a 2,000 health point barrier as well? But and not only that, a lot of the damage numbers are lower. So having a shield is insane in comparison to some of the other tanks. A lot of these other tanks are just bad, and you kind of just needed a Reinhardt all the time. Like, you could play Winston in a lot of cases if there's high ground, but Ryan is kind of a must pick for the average player at the launch of the game. Roadhog Scrap Gun is reverted back to the old version. And the most important thing, remembering from Overwatch 2 to 1, is here, hook 1.0. Okay, you could hook people through space and time. You throw it out around a corner, and it doesn't need line of sight. It's more of like a projectile almost. The hook can land without you even seeing them, essentially. So toss these around the corner and hook people in randomly. Have fun with that. He was a really gimmicky character for a lot of times, because remember, you could pick a tank that protects your whole team, super easy to play around, great ultimate, or you could pick this guy who, while yes, there is no anti-nade, Also, Take a Breather was much worse. You had to stand still while you healed yourself over time. It was also an all-in ability, not on a resource. You popped it and you're gonna vape for a while. Overall, not a very good character in most iterations, honestly. Now, Winston is going to not have his long-range attack, of course, from Overwatch 2, and the projected barrier is on a much longer cooldown, so you have to be much more careful when you use it. But if you're skilled as Winston, I think this is a character that's probably going to get an outmoded performance, because people didn't really learn how to play Winston until later on in the life cycle. And I think if you went back in this version, you're going to notice that you can cleave and target certain things down without big healing numbers. You can dominate the game on Winston in this version of the game, I think. People just weren't very good at him at the launch era. And while there is no Winston Diva synergy, in theory, you could do the Winston Zarya synergy as long as you know how to focus on the backline, which a lot of players just didn't know how to do for years and years, right? Like, if Winston goes against Rein, he'll lose, but there's a lot of cases where, like, especially on Hanamura B, defending, really hard for the enemy to ever get in with a Winston cleaving in the chokes. There's a lot of characters that just can't really get away from you or fight you that well. So it's like half the characters are pretty diveable by Winston, honestly, just by the mere stats alone. We'll see. I think this is one of those characters that is going to have an outmoded performance if with the new skill of the current player base going back in time to play it. Zarya, the major change here is your bubbles are on split cooldowns. You get one for yourself, one for your teammate. So this made for some cool interactions with using them as a meat shield in front of you to cycle. So you would bubble your teammate for them to take space, then transition with them and cycle your cooldowns and rotate who's in front. And this made for the Rein Zarya gameplay that everyone is missing from 6v6 Overwatch. You gain a lot more charge than you're used to in Overwatch 2, so Zarya can be very, very lethal. Probably one of the most carry type heroes without the most mechanics. Like, we can look at Widowmaker or Tracer as being super carry in patch 1.0, but Zarya was a top pick if you weren't necessarily as good, because it really rewarded you for your game sense and tank gameplay. Zarya's like a key carry pick, and honestly, like, just top meta pick overall, because you've been playing Assault a lot. Having Grav is like, your whole team could be useless. You could never get space, but as long as you have Grav, you're going to get some kills, right? And you need to get a big team wipe in a lot of these modes in order to get the objective at all. So Graviton Surge was super important. She's just good at every stage of the game, basically. Lucio, they note that the sound wave is now different, where now it's really local, and they gave him a lot of improvements to his wall bouncing so he can keep up with his team. Back in this version, it was 30 meters. Okay, that's massive. And that meant you could wall ride from afar and apply the effects of healing and speed to your team. In general, though, not a great healer. The stats are kind of low. You basically wanted to use him for speed to get in and out, to dodge ultimates. But I would say, and I'm surprised they didn't put this, like, the stats on his dueling got improved over time a lot. So if you think you're just going to go duel things as Lucio now, you have another thing coming. The damage numbers were much worse, and the projectiles are harder to hit. You kind of feel like you're throwing popcorn at them a little bit, where they're just going to shake it off. So you definitely don't want to try to take duels in this version of Lucio. He's much more defensive and more about his ultimate. Like, a true support is how you're going to feel. This was before they tried to make supports playmakers. And then in this version, it was not only common to not get tank players, which felt required. In 1.0, it was hard to get support players. Now, that changed when the most popular character ever got added with Ana, who's not in this version, keep in mind. But you can kind of see how support might not be the most popular role when these are our options. It literally is just Mercy and Lucio. That's it. We can say Zenyatta down here, but we'll see why that's not really an option in a second. So Mercy, biggest change is mass res, where Lucio can drop a sound barrier to protect you from lots of ultimates, like Dragon Blade, for example. You have enough health to withstand it. Mercy could allow your team to fall victim to a Grav Dragon combo, or Grav Pulse Bomb as well, and swoop in and mass res everybody. Very, very strong. Counteracts ult stacks, which are a big part of the game. So Mercy was a top pick. And there was like a little mini game of trying to find the Mercy at the end of the fight, because if she was crafty, she might hide and let her team all die together. That was a bit of a strategy at the time, where if they're going for a big team wipe, which again, usually required to get the objective, she could hide off and then fly in to undo it entirely. A lot of people didn't like this. I didn't mind it personally myself. I thought mass res was kind of interesting and allowed for texture to the game. And you can kind of see how Overwatch 1.0 had a lot of these things where there's certain characters that couldn't move and that's it. They can get countered. Or Mercy, stats weren't that high, not a lot of skill expression, but huge ultimate play. High risk, high reward. The design of the game back then was far more counter-pickable, where certain characters just didn't function against others. And, well, I think Mercy is one of those key answers of like, well, if you pick her, you can withstand some of the most clear win conditions in the game. So kind of nuts. Symettra, crazy character, sort of an odd idea. The teleporter gives you a faster spawn. So rather than an active teleporter that sends your team around the map, instead you build it and then they leave spawn to get back to the point faster. This is kind of only good for defense. Symettra was, again, a character you just kind of couldn't pick on attack without being a major liability to your team. But she's in the support category because she gives constant shields to allies. You cast it and they gain a bit of overhealth. This overhealth idea, kind of weird. The sentry turrets were a bit more annoying as well, where you could stack like 6 of them above a choke and the enemy had to clear them to get out of the choke. They called that a car wash strat. And then I think one more aspect that they don't list here is that her alternate fire would pierce through the enemies. That's probably one of the best parts about it. Nowadays, it's more of a normal shooter projectile where you want to line it up and hit the thing. This version was really slow, and because of that, you really are only hitting things when they're all stacked up in the choke, and you would cleave through. You're not really expecting to kill anything. You're just like helping your team do supportive damage. And then on top of that, there was a beam weapon that locked on. They don't explain this either, I don't think. But the regular beam, it did amp up, but it was a lock-on effect. So if a Genji gets on you, you sort of chase him, and you don't have to aim. You just like lock onto them, and eventually it'll do more damage over time, and they have to get the heck out of there. And if you don't fall victim to all of those things, Sim is kind of an obvious throw pick. The easiest counter pick character in the history of the game is this version of Sim. You go Pharah, nothing she does helps, right? And Pharah flies over the sky of you. Everything she wants to fight isn't there. You can hard counter pick in this version of the game. And speaking of harsh counter picks, Zenyatta is probably one of the more easy to counter heroes in the history of the game. So much so that you really would have to apply some outrageous skill to keep this guy alive. They don't mention it here, but he has 150 health. Okay. So Tracer, who isn't even in her peak form because there's a lot of other characters that are overtuned in this patch, but Tracer very, very easily one clips a Zen, like sneezes on him and he falls over. Now, high risk, high reward, the damage amp goes up to 50% on Discord Orb, which is insane. Don't get me wrong. You keep Zen alive, it's very win more. I would say if you can keep them from getting out of the choke in Hanamura, then Zen looks pretty good because as long as he's not easily falling over in the mid fight, him having Transcendence is an ult that can keep you alive. It's another defensive ult. So it's another option. It's just so much high risk, high reward. You often wouldn't want to play him, but he was pretty popular for his design as being a DPS minded support, which is why we ended up getting so many thereafter, because people wanted to play him, but he wasn't very competitively viable because he's just so glass and hard to play. He's a big liability. Like, think of the bad team comps you could make in this. Like, you could have a Zenyatta and a Symettra, a Roadhog and a Diva, a Torb and a Mei. And they could go like Reinhardt, Cassidy, or a Pharah and a Mercy. Like, the gaps of the possible team comps here are outrageous. The counter picking is so unreal, where if you pick a bad comp in this, you are going to get blown out, okay? Like, never winning a fight. It's kind of nuts. It's just how badly balanced this version of the game is. I had said for years that we don't want the game to be balanced, but if you say you do, you should expect every hero to be somewhat competitively viable across all of the maps that we have, right? If the game is more balanced, we should expect fluid counterpicking to matter, whereas this version, it's so unbalanced, there's a lot of options that you clearly wouldn't even consider in that scenario because they're so bad, so unbalanced. And that might be a better version of the game. I don't know. It'd be interesting how our new player base goes back and sees just the gap between the playability of some of these characters. You've got a character like Pharah with splash damage super easy, and then you might have a character like Sim who doesn't interact with her at all and doesn't even play the game that the Pharah is playing. It's flying overhead, hard counters you, kills your whole team, and you contribute nothing. Like, it's kind of nuts. Having Sim one tricks was one of the most annoying things in Overwatch 1, and well, it'll be interesting to see how our new player base plays this version of the game, because in 2016 a lot of players came into Overwatch wanting to play in an expressive way, to play the characters they identified with, whereas now, or everybody wants to min-max, this is the counterpick to that, and here's the strategy, and hey, you gotta swap. Like, that was a bit of our community in Overwatch 1, but it wasn't the majority of players. So I'm very interested to see how that plays out. Keep in mind, Assault, if you know how to play Dive, it will help you in these modes. Back in the day, a Mei on Hanamura or a Junkrat on Anubis would hard carry the defenses of these maps, the control maps we remember, but Pharah and Widow, very, very strong on either of these, just based on the sightlines and the movement and where you can go. Escort is not going to have the map reworks and improvements. King's Row is definitely one of the better maps of all time. A lot of people like it. I tend to dislike it a little more as the game goes on, especially in the power creep era. But in patch 1.0, you can really see the gameplay diversity here, where all of the characters can kind of have a role in this map, whereas the other maps, it's a little tough where they're not so suited. It's really hard to pick a bad hero on like a dive map in Overwatch 1.0, whereas King's Row has a little bit of everything, so you kind of can always make everything contribute. So that's it, Overwatch Classic 1.0. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. I hope you guys enjoy it, and I really am thankful for them making this type of thing a reality, because it only makes the current version of Overwatch look that much better, in my opinion. Like, I don't know how anyone would be like, this is the version of the game we should keep. I would be very shocked if the community felt that way, because it's so archaic and stiff and goes against a lot of the things they say they want. Oftentimes when people say they want one thing, they don't actually want the byproducts of that. Like, they say they wanted all the characters to be balanced, but really we just had a community that wanted to pick bad heroes for the situation and not play the game competitively in Overwatch 1. Now it's the opposite. Now it feels like most of our community that still plays the game are competitive. So maybe this sort of harsh counterpick version of the game, where a lot of the heroes aren't viable for a given situation, maybe this is a better version that we're more happy with. Because if you think about it, look through the hero roster, there's a bunch of picks in here that I will say are tech picks, as in, you better have them fully set up and your team around it, or it be the best part of the map to use them on, or they're just bad, okay? Some of the heroes were good, and the other heroes were extremely situational. So we're gonna say Cassidy, good. Genji, good. Pharah, good. Reaper, okay. Soldier, good-ish. Tracer, good. Bastion, super tech. Hanzo, you need to be a specialist. Junkrat, map dependent. Mei, a little bit more viable just because of the maps, and she's pretty easy. So for the average player, much better. Top tier players, not so much. Torbjorn, super tech. Widowmaker, outrageously strong. Diva, terrible. Reinhardt, meta. Roadhog, tech and probably specialist and probably avoid. Winston, if you're a specialist, you're going to do work with. Zarya plays the game, utterly required, I think, most of the time. It'll be hard for you to play normal Overwatch without this character, but keep in mind, you don't have to pick tanks. You could just flank. But the problem is, like, if you pick multiple DPS, the problem with that is against Torbjorn with an auto turret, it's like really hard to flank. And there's a bunch of things that are going to stand up to that. So you kind of do need tanks in this mode to even get anywhere. Lucio was widely unpopular, but meta. That's the strange thing. He was required to play the game. People didn't like picking him for the longest time, which is why they eventually made him into a duelist. The supportive version of him wasn't very popular. Mercy eventually fell off in value at the higher tiers, but even in this version, Lucio Mercy was played because the top meta for a time was like Cassidy, Widow, Pharah, and a bit of Genji as well in the launch era of the game. Symettra, super tech, massive liability. I would say Symettra in this version and for a while thereafter in launch was the most dead weight character you could have on your team, because a lot of what she does, even when you master it, kind of doesn't do anything. Especially if you're on attack,